Hello everybody and welcome back to RPG Radio. My name is Winvac, and on today's episode I'm going to be showing you my Battlemage build. This build is physical and elemental damage focused while having some decent survivability and huge AoE damage. This build leans heavily into the AoE abilities of both the Soldier and the Arcanist's trees to deal damage and clear rooms, while also having a very strong auto attack from a special component that we'll talk about later in the video. Now this video will be focused mainly on leveling for this class and this build, so don't read too much into the gear or the devotions. Those will be much more important in the next video, but as far as you know right now, we focus a lot of our stats on elemental damage, physical damage, and points into abilities like Calidor's Tempest and Warcry. Those are the big two room clearing abilities that we've got for the moment, and they are the most important. This is a YouTube video though, so feel free to like and subscribe your heart out and leave me a comment down below if you've played this build before or if you're seeing any shortcomings in the gameplay that I might have missed. I'll point one out for you right now. This build does manage to take a lot of damage really quick if I am not looking out for it. And we'll use that as a bit of a jumping off point. Right now, this build is using a one-hand and a caster offhand in terms of main weapons. So, I may add a shield, or we may just forego the shield entirely and play a little bit more slippery, careful of a playstyle. For the leveling process though, with as many points as we've got in our abilities and as much damage as they are dealing, it's not a huge deal. Even losing big chunks of health at this moment isn't going to matter a whole lot, because a lot of the things in the room that can deal damage to us to kill us are dead way before it's actually relevant. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago the big two abilities for this build are going to be Calidor's Tempest and the Warcry from the Soldier tree. At the moment, we don't have the points in Devastation in the video, but later on down the road, we're going to pick that up too, and there is a monster infrequent that is going to buff that for us. That'll go into the place of our main hand weapon. There's a lot that will evolve throughout this video for this build, but that'll all be kind of going on in the background, and I'll tell you about it along the way. So we'll start with one of the cornerstones of the build, actually, the Shard of Baroneth. That is a component that is only usable at level 55, and you're going to hook it up to your main hand weapon. The Shard is actually going to give you the ability to use an attack modifier that will build up charges while you are attacking. Those charges are going to grant you physical and elemental damage with your swings, and they are incredibly potent because you can stack them up to about 7 stacks, I think, and at that point they're doing a little under 1.5 times the damage that you start with, which is pretty nutty considering. Now, those auto attacks are going to be a fallback as far as damage is concerned. They make a lot of sense because a lot of the other stuff that we're going to be using gear-wise once we get up to those levels is Baroneth charged, or at least in name, but the other things going on in this kit are more focused on Calidor's and Warcry and some of the other Arcanist abilities. That being said, I specifically sought out all of the Baroneth items, meaning the amulet, the legendary amulet, that is, the eye, the belt, which is probably the least flashy of the entire set, Baroneth Reforged, which is a sword that we can't use until level 75, the Shard, which we can use at 55, which is amazing, and then I think that's it for everything off the top of my head. I may be missing one, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you can think of it and I can't. There's 2 amulets, actually, for Baroneth. One is the Essence of Baroneth and one is the Eye. Eye is legendary, Essence is epic, but both do pretty decent stuff, so once we transition over to that legendary one, we're not going to take any sort of penalty for moving on up to a different set. Anyway, there are also a couple passives going on. We also have an exclusive skill in our Star Pact coming from the Arcanist tree. Star Pact is going to be increasing some damage for us. While we may not constantly be using all 3 elemental types of damage, the elemental damage that we deal will still be buffing the fire and lightning that we produce more often than not. So, Kalidor's Tempest is going to be doing a lot of fire and lightning damage of its own. There is some Aether damage in this build as well as just kind of an afterthought, but it does exist. Mostly, though, we're going to be on that fire and lightning train, with Kalidor's Tempest doing the fire and lightning bits, and then Warcry, the other ability in the build at the moment, is going to be dealing percent health damage, as well as providing some pretty strong CC that should taunt the enemies towards us. All of that will pull them in, then blow them up, and be on our merry way. There's really not a whole lot to worry about when it comes to having tons of enemies all around you. Even better than that, at least in the normal leveling portion of this build, your AoE abilities are going to be really, really strong for clearing big bosses too. You'll see in just a little bit here, we're going to run up into the boss room for Act 5. Oh, what is his name? Theoden Marcel, the Shaper of Flesh. That guy, in his big weird room of corpses and bones and stuff, is going to get absolutely shredded, all 3 forms, pretty quickly with this build. And the only thing that we really have to do in that fight is dodge a couple of big goofy abilities from the floaty bone guy himself, and watch him struggle to keep his health bar up. Another ability that is missing from the bar right now that we haven't put any points into is the Mirror of Arioctes from the Arcanist. I know I've always said in every build that I have ever played with the Arcanist that you should put exactly 1 point into that ability, but in playing this build and dealing with everything that comes along with it, I don't think that is entirely necessary until, well, about level 60-ish. We'll pick it up probably towards the end of this video, just because I don't like losing those big chunks of health that we are in the earlier parts. But Mirror of Arioctes, I don't think you'll need it until about 50 to 60, because the amount of damage that you can do with Warcry and Kalidor's Tempest is going to be astronomical and make clearing rooms so easy that you really shouldn't take a lot of concerning damage. That being said, make sure that you max out both Kalidor's Tempest and Warcry as soon as possible. Get those mastery bars up very, very quickly and start clearing them rooms. After that, you'll have other passives come up that are going to be important. Like I mentioned earlier, Star Pact is going to be adding damage to places that you need it. You'll also take Iskandra's Elemental Exchange. That should be the 3rd ability that you upgrade to the maximum. And a lot of those points you should be getting from gear too. Don't forget to get gear that helps with those early points, just because you don't always have the most in the early stages of the game to maximize that stuff. Right now, I have enough points in both Kalidor's, Warcry, and also Iskandra's that the 2 and 3 points that I'm getting from gear are putting them into max ranks. I have gear taking up about half the points of each of those abilities, so they can do maximum damage while not consuming all of my brain power with those skill point decisions. We're also using Menhir's Will, which is a passive from the soldier side of things, that when we get too low in health, if we ever do dip below that scary threshold, the soldier skill will kick in, give us a whole bunch of health back, and let us run away from certain death. So having that panic option available because of the soldier is very important but it'll be even more important as the game progresses. Just jumping into Flesh Weaver Krieg, as if the Warden version of this guy wasn't gross enough. We've just got to take him down one more time to make it permanent. Also, if you didn't know this was here, this is a side mission. You can turn this in at the Steelcap District in Act 5, the headquarters. It's worth some decent XP. I would highly recommend doing it because anytime that we can whack Warden Krieg, I think it's worth it. Now, since this is an Arcanist build, one thing I will suggest is that you do a decent chunk of farming for items in Act 5. Because Act 5 is so full of Aether enemies and possessed Arcanists, you can get a lot of really, really good monster infrequent from this act of the game, and those do an extremely good things for any Arcanist build. That being said, you just got to keep an eye out for which ones specifically are buffing the skills that you need or providing the stats that you need, but there is tons of them. Now, I mentioned it a little bit ago, but the final boss of Act 5, Theoden Marcel, the Master of Flesh, you can just see all of the damage that we are doing to him. He's already popped out of first form into second within 10 seconds of entering the room. If it weren't for the amount of animation in his transition phases, this fight would be over already. Now, the only thing we really have to worry about is one or two of his abilities catching us unawares and deleting our whole health bar as fast as, we deal damage. But as long as we're dipping and diving and ducking and dodging and juking all over the place, it shouldn't be a big deal. Now we've got weird Flesh Angel Theoden walking all over the place. It's just not going to be a good day for this boss. Really isn't. Dodging this sky drop, picking up his missive, and then ransacking all of these weird flesh and bone chests for any goodies left. Doesn't look like we're going to get anything from that one. No legendaries there, and nothing legendary either. So he got slapped, and just to be vindictive, he was making sure that he kept all the good treasure to himself. Moving on, though, we're going to switch into Act 6? No, it's Act 7, isn't it? Act 6 is the second half of Melmoth. Act 5 is the swampy, gross bit of Melmoth. So pretty sure that's how it works. Correct me if I'm wrong. You know what to do. You know where the comment bar is. I'm sure you know how to type and spell things, so the message will get to me. I read them all at the end of the day. Now, you may have noticed that we also picked up Devastation at this point, and we've got a couple extra gear points into that ability as well. So all of the damage that we're doing right now is in a very, very big AoE, and we can reach almost the entire screen worth of enemies in order to deal that damage. So things are looking up, and damage is becoming varied. Now, devotions aren't going to be hugely important for leveling this build, but what I will say to do is put as many points into your devotions to get you up to the Blind Sage. Blind Sage is going to be offering you all of the elemental damage types, and if you don't want to take one or two of them, since we only deal 2 of the 3 elemental damage types, you don't have to. But the passive from the Blind Sage is the Elemental Seeker, which is going to be dealing elemental damage on its own, and I believe those pets are unkillable. In this particular video, you won't be seeing that passive because we're still a point or two off, but once the next video rolls around, you'll see how all of those devotions interact with each other, because we will have maxed out 55 devotion points, whereas this video only has about 35, I think, by the end of it. Other than that, some key devotions that you might want to pick up are going to be the Scholar's Light, the Quill, and the Elementalist. Not the Elementalist, the Mage. The Mage is the one that gives us Fissure. Fissure is that little volcano that you can see pop up when we use our abilities that spews a whole bunch of fire damage out. Very, very, very good ability. I use it on basically every fire build at this point because it's just so... It happens so often, it does so much damage, it's just so worth it. I've never had a time where I've looked at a Magi devotion and said, not for me. Now, in terms of modifiers for this build, you do not need the Warcry modifiers, mainly because they don't add a whole lot to what the ability in itself is used for. Number one, it's used for crowd control and pulling people towards you with its taunt, and number two, it's used for that max health damage. The upgrade to it isn't going to benefit either of those things in a really meaningful way, and the single point modifier is going to change it from pulling people in to terrifying people away. Now, ultimately, that is not something I want to do with this build because I have Kalidor's Tempest dealing damage in a shorter radius than that, so I want people walking closer to me as often as possible. But if you're playing this build and you're instead using something like an Albrecht's Aether Ray over Kalidor's Tempest, I would see the ability being a little bit more important there to terrify enemies away. But I like melee boys. I like getting close on the bad guys. I'm not a huge fan of kiting and running away with channel abilities like a lot of caster builds focus on. So, we're playing the melee one, we're going up close and personal, dealing as much burst damage as possible, and that is the way it will remain as long as I'm having fun with it. I also mentioned a little bit ago the passives for the build. Menhir's Will being one to save you in a panicked state, but you'll also want a couple points into military conditioning to get that percent physique and health bonus. Getting those big bonuses will make you tankier, more survivable, just good to have all around when it comes to playing a squishy half Arcanist class. Now, the other one that will be turning on passively is going to be Maven's Sphere of Protection. This one's going to give us some damage absorption while it's on, but eventually we'll get the conversion portion of the ability going as well to get increased energy absorption from enemy spells and reduced CC durations too. Maven's is a very, very, very strong defensive opportunity, and we'll need that when the time comes to hop into the bigger difficulties of the game. On Iskandra's Elemental Exchange as well, you'll want to pick up Overload. Overload is going to help us deal some more damage in the overtime department from all of the fire, lightning, and cold. Well, the elemental resources, obviously. And then it's also going to give us some Aether resistance. Actually, a pretty hefty chunk of Aether resistance. So that means that we just always have about 20 to 25% Aether res going while that modifier is on and the passive is equipped. And then Elemental Balance, the final portion of Iskandra's Elemental Exchange, is going to buff our crit damage, while again buffing those damage over time options of our elemental damage with an increased duration. Mainly what I want there is the crit damage, because that is how we just pop people, but that is definitely worth taking. Now, for Kalidor's Tempest, remember the modifier is really important on it, the Wrath of Agravix. This is going to give the ability a 30% weapon damage bonus, and it's also going to modify the total damage of the ability by 170% and give you a knockdown of 1.5 seconds. It's also going to increase the cooldown of the ability to 5 seconds, so you can't spam this anymore. But honestly, I don't really like playing the spam game with it anyway, so this is right up my alley. Lastly, we'll pick up Inferno on it so that we can get more flat lightning damage, flat burn damage, and then continue to buff that fire damage on the ability as well. All of that being said, these are pretty easy to get along without until you notice the damage drop off. So if you see your Calidor's Tempest dealing less damage, start dumping those points into Inferno. The last passive that we've got for the Arcanist side of things is Mental Alacrity. Mental Alacrity is going to add a huge amount of energy to your character, which makes using all of your abilities all the time much easier. It's also going to increase our casting speed and decrease our skill energy cost. So at 9 out of 10, it is reducing the energy cost by 19% and giving us 10% casting speed. But at 20, that's 12% casting speed with negative 20% skill energy cost. I can tell right now all the gears are turning in your head and you're like, wow, I understand just how crazy good that is. Doesn't take a lot to figure that out, but I'm glad we made the journey there together. And really, that's it for abilities. In terms of gear, like I said, none of it's really super important, but we did manage to pick up a monster infrequent, which is one of the Arcanist ones, and that's the Ascendant Conduit. This is a monster infrequent that modifies Flash Freeze, which we don't use, but also modifies Maven's Sphere of Protection. So that's going to be buffing fire and cold damage, while also letting the passive give us another 8% maximum health, which is nutty and butty. The other monster infrequent that we've got going is the Coerced Wraith. That is an offhand. It's one of the ones that you'll find here in Act 7, but it is it's going to add a smaller target area to Devastation, but it's going to give it 30% crit damage and convert all of the Aether damage to lightning, which is amazing because, again, elemental build with a focus on the lightning and fire portions of those elements. So that's it for gear that's going to make any relative note through this build guide, but you don't have to look out for those until you're getting up to level 50-ish, 60-ish. And that is going to be it. If you liked this video, guys, stick around for the next one. We'll have much more to talk about when that one comes around. And for the time being, feel free to let me know if you need these leveling guides or if you want to see something different in between. I know we try to do these in 2 parts, but I'm always open to suggestions. Anyway, thanks so much for hanging out. I will see you guys next time. Peace out.